Good morning to all you wonderful children. We're wrapping up this chapter and moving forward. Obviously, yesterday we were not here thanks to a power outage, but we want to finish off this chapter, and by now you should have taken the political compass test. So you should hopefully have an idea of where you are. Make sure you follow the directions on the video so you know how to take care of that. Upload the image to Schoology. So let's finish this out here. Now, we talked about different belief systems, about different political belief systems, and what people ascribe themselves to, whether it be liberalism, conservatism, libertarianism, or a populism. That's where Americans are going to fall. But let's talk about the factors that explain this, okay? Because you can look at certain characteristics about a person and figure out uh, where they probably fall on the political spectrum. All right, and one of the biggest factors in terms of figuring out somebody's ideology or belief system first is education. Okay, your level of education matters. The more highly educated a person is, the more likely they are to be liberal. All right, and remember, education does not always equate with intelligence. Okay, but high education tends to lead towards people being more liberal. Well, of course, one of the biggest questions we want to ask is why is that the case? Why do people with college degrees or postgraduate degrees like a master's or a PhD, why do they become more liberal? All right, well, think about the nature of college. Okay, first, you're going to live probably on campus with a large group of individuals who have different ways of living and thinking than you do, and you're exposed to more not only in that, but in different classes. Okay, and contrary to what some people would have you believe, colleges are not trying to brainwash you, they're giving you different perspectives about life and culture. That's why people who are more highly educated tend to be on the liberal side. That doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that they're more intelligent. It just means they're exposed to a variety of different ways of thinking and living. For instance, when I was growing up, I don't think I'd ever had much contact with people who were international, who lived in another country. And when I was in college, there was an interesting little fellow, a black fellow from Denmark, on the floor of my dorm, and I didn't even think Denmark had anybody other than really white people. And interestingly enough, his name was Victor, and Victor was probably one of the most entertaining people I've ever met in my life. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Education matters. It factors into why people tend to be more liberal. Okay. Now let's talk about race. Okay. Race matters. If the only thing you knew about somebody was their race, it would give you a little bit of insight whether they're more liberal or conservative. For instance, wait a second. Did we say race? Oh, look at that. Uh, race cars, get it? Race cars. Okay, anyway, race matters. If we look at black Americans, we have to ask, does that factor alone mean they're more liberal or conservative? And the answer is they're more liberal. Okay, black people tend to be more liberal. Why is that the case? Look at the history of black people in this country. Ultimately, especially in the last 60 to 70 years, it has been liberalism or Democrats who have been supporting the issues that matter the most. Currently, you look at Black Lives Matter, but you look in the past, certain racial programs, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, all initiated by liberals, Democrats. Okay. Now, some of you might be thinking too, wait a second, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. All right. And that's true. Abraham Lincoln does sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and he is largely responsible for the freedom of black Americans. However, you have to remember at the time, okay, even though the Republicans are a new party and they want something different for America, the idea of freeing the slaves is a liberal idea. Okay, it goes against tradition and culture of the time. Right? So black people tend to be more liberal. Let's talk about Hispanic people. Okay, Hispanic people tend to be more liberal as well. Most Hispanic cultures are going to look at this situation and say, hey, whose programs and ideas will benefit us the most? And the answer is the liberal side of things. They have looser policies on immigration, and Hispanic people, like black Americans, have faced a certain amount of discrimination, and liberals are the ones sticking up for them. Liberals are the ones that are essentially saying, you know what, we need to change. We need to move forward in society. All right, now, it's important to note too that there is one group of Hispanics that definitely are not liberal. Okay, uh, I want you to think about this for a second, and obviously I'll tell you, but can you think of any one group within the Hispanic community that just might absolutely hate anything political on the left wing? All right. And if you're thinking of Cuba, you got it right. In Cuba, they obviously are under a communist government, and they have been since 1959. And they do not like that type of government. They're like, the government's too intrusive. They are absolutely uh, going to wreck everything, just like they did in Cuba. And so they don't want to touch anything that is even remotely like what they left in Cuba. Okay, so black people tend to be more liberal, Hispanic people tend to be more liberal, except for the Cubans. Okay, don't forget about the Cubans. Now, also, even though it's still a very small population within the community or within America, let's talk about Asians for a second. Okay, Asians do tend to lean towards the more conservative side. Tradition and culture traditional culture is very important to them. Typically, Asians who have immigrated to this country are people who got here because they had skills and the ability to generate more wealth than other people. Now, the number of Asians living in the country is still kind of low to make predictions about. They're always going to be this way, but generally speaking, and look, you have to remember that's true for every race and ethnicity we've mentioned. It doesn't mean if you're black or Hispanic you can't be conservative, or if you're a Cuban you still might not be liberal or Asian or anything else. Okay, let's talk about white people now. Right, and I say this in a kind of joking fashion, but it's serious too. If the only factor that you knew about somebody was white, and you had to make a prediction about their ideology, it would tell you nothing at all. Okay, white people are liberal, white people are conservative. They're just a mixed bag. All right. So education matters, race matters in predicting somebody's ideology, belief systems. All right. Let's talk about religion. Okay, religion matters. Now, there are some generalizations we're going to make about these. So let's start with the three major religions. Okay, we'll start with Judaism. What about Jewish people in America? Do they tend to be more liberal or conservative? And the answer is they are more liberal. Now, a lot of people want to point to their traditional lifestyle and their adherence to certain rules and regulations, but if there's anyone in the world who understands what it's like to be persecuted and to be marginalized, it's the Jews. You think about their entire history, including a great deal of time in America, and they're like, hey, we're a minority, a religious minority at that, who has not been well liked throughout their history, and ultimately uh, they tend to vote more liberal and be more liberal. Uh, they saw what happens in an extreme right-wing government in fascist Germany, and so now they're always going to vote more liberal, um, and that's the reality that we live in right now. Now, again, it doesn't mean you won't run into some Jews who are conservative, but by and large, Jews tend to be more on the liberal side. All right, let's talk about Muslims. Okay, Muslims tend to be more conservative, even though Muslims in the United States, obviously, they are stereotyped in a lot of ways. Muslims adhere to a traditional family lifestyle. They are more, I don't want to say rigid in their beliefs, but they are more accepting of a conservative social values, and their social values are way more important to them than other things like economic values. Okay, so Jews tend to be more liberal, Muslims tend to be more conservative. What about Christians? Okay, now don't jump to conclusions on this because Christians, it depends upon the denomination. All right, certain denominations tend to lean more conservative, and certain denominations tend to go more liberal. And we'll start first with Catholics. Okay, Catholics make up a sizable chunk of American Christians, and Catholics tend to be more liberal. They faced a good deal of persecution within the United States. They've always been met with some skepticism, especially in politics. And so they've been marginalized to an extent, and they tend to vote more on the liberal side. Now, that could be changing because there are certain viewpoints uh, in the future that they're struggling with. Abortion, same sex marriage are things that liberals have supported that the Catholic Church does not support. So we'll see how that plays out. But Catholics tend to be more liberal. They're going to vote liberal too. They're typically going to vote Democrat. All right. Baptists, okay? Baptists tend to be more conservative. That's one of the predominant denominations here in West Virginia. And look, I know, and if you know anything about the Christian church and Baptists, there are a million different varieties of Baptist. You got the American Baptist, the Southern Baptist, the Independent Baptist, the Free Will Baptist. In fact, you can put Baptist with almost any words, and there's probably a church for it. I'm just going to go ahead and say if it says Baptist on the church, they're probably conservative. Okay, so Catholics more liberal, Baptists more conservative. Uh, what about our Mormon friends? The Mormons they're pretty darn conservative. They look at the Baptists and they're like, you guys are too permissive. Just kidding, as a joke. All right, now, those are your major denominations, but typically any other denomination in America, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, they usually tend to be more liberal. The biggest denominations in terms of political activity and whether they tend to be more liberal or conservative are your Catholics, your Baptists, and ultimately the Mormons. Okay, now religion matters quite a bit. Those are your three major religions, but there's one more I want to mention that's significant in terms of your ability to make an assessment. Okay, what about atheists? People who aren't religious at all. Those people definitely tend to be more liberal. They look at some of the religious traditions of the past and some of the morality of the past, and they look at it and say, I don't understand why. Uh, and if you don't adhere to a particular belief system of a religion, then obviously you wouldn't feel compelled to obey those moral standards, right? So, education, race, religion, those things matter in factoring ideology. Gender also matters, all right? Men tend to be more conservative and women tend to be more liberal, right? Why is that the case? Women are more soft-hearted, they're more caring and compassionate, and think of things like social programs, okay? Women are the ones who are more prone to supporting that because, for example, let's say it's a program that benefits children. Um, and women are the ones who typically spend more time raising children and they have maternal instincts. Whether you want to agree with that or not, I think that's true. But that aside, the statistics bear out the fact that women tend to be more liberal. Men look at situations and they're like, hey, you should be responsible for yourself and you should be responsible for your own children. They look at things more in the conservative light. Okay? And remember, that doesn't mean if you're a man, you automatically are conservative, or if you're a woman, you're automatically liberal. I'm just telling you, generally speaking. Okay? All right, let's talk about income, money. All right, finish this sentence for me. The more money you make, all right, the more liberal or conservative you are. And the answer is definitely conservative. When your income goes up, you're going to become more conservative. All right. And you might be thinking too, and I'm just going to anticipate this for a second. Wait a second. The higher the amount of education you have, you're more liberal. And usually when you have higher amount of education, you make more money. So which is it? Like a high amount of money ultimately leads you to be more conservative. Well, the answer is this. Uh, Income and education are not always linked together. Okay. For example, I have a master's degree. I have a very high level of education. Okay. Now, I don't make that much money compared to other people with master's degrees in different fields. All right. And then you look at other people in the world, like, for example, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. If you don't know Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, neither one of them ever finished college. They don't have high levels of education, but they definitely have a much higher income than I do. In fact, uh, my dad makes significantly more money than I do, and he doesn't have a high degree of education. He's worked in the car business his entire life. So Ultimately, income and education are not the same. Now, the more money you have, you get more conservative because if, let's say, you're making $200,000 a year, all right, if you're working in a job in a system that allows you to make $200,000 a year, and in West Virginia, I promise you that will get you a good quality of life, all right? If you're making that much money in that system, you don't want that system to change. You want to preserve and protect what has gotten you to this point, okay? You don't want to see change, all right? Geography, we already kind of talked about this to an extent, but you can see more of the conservatives are in the South, in rural areas. You look at this graphic about Gallup polls showing you that the Southerners, and to an extent the Midwest too, tend to be more conservative than most people. And you get the Northeast, which is your liberal area, and to an extent the Northwest too, but by and large that concentration's in the Northeast. Okay. Uh, your geography matters. Remember also urban areas, definitely more that way. But why is that? Why do more urban areas tend to be on the liberal side? Okay. Urban areas, you get a huge variety of people and ways of living. If you've never been to New York City, I would highly recommend going one time just because of the massiveness of it. There are so many different types of people. You can walk down any street there and you get people speaking different languages, different clothing styles. People just learn to accept certain differences even if they don't agree with it. So ultimately, they tend to be more on the liberal side. Okay, let's talk about sexual orientation. Right, the fact that somebody's heterosexual doesn't tell you anything. But if somebody is gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, part of the LGBT community at all, they're going to be more liberal. All right, the same reason that racial minorities are more liberal, they're more liberal. They specifically look at situations and say, hey, we have been marginalized for a number of years, and the liberals are the ones who are sticking up for our rights, the ones who are saying we should be included, and we don't ascribe to the traditional ways of living. Right? Now, let's mention family impact on this as well. Once again, your family is going to have one of the biggest impacts. Whatever belief system the parents of a child have, ultimately their children pick up on those too. Okay, so if you got two parents who are really conservative, the odds are that their children are going to be pretty conservative too. Right? If you got two parents who are really liberal, the odds are that they're going to be liberal as well. All right, now you might be asking a couple of questions. First of all, uh, what happens if you got one parent who is liberal and one who's conservative? And the answer is kids tend to gravitate towards the parent that they identify with the most. Okay, and it's not always, I'm not talking about the one they love the most, because maybe you got two parents and you love them equally. It's the one you feel a little more connected to. Maybe you feel similar in how you think and live, and the one that you identify with the most is the one you'll gravitate towards their beliefs. Okay. Um, Family is a big impact, and even though parents are obviously the biggest one, uh, extended family, siblings, they impact you as well. And also, I know that some of you right now, like there's a couple people in particular I can already think of, that your parents, you're way different than them. Okay, uh, you'll find out though that that's not, like I said, we're speaking in general terms. All right. Now, let's talk about age. One more thing almost forgot. What about certain non-traditional families? And what we mean by that is, what about a family that is, or children who come from a single parent family? You're going to see them be more on the liberal side because typically who's the single parent? Usually it's mom, and mom tends to be more on the liberal side, not always. And also, single moms who are raising one or more children, they are going to be probably someone who has benefited from a government program to some extent. Okay, now let's talk about age. Okay, as age increases, you will get more conservative. Okay, as age increases, several things happen. One is you start to accumulate more wealth. Okay, the good news is that as you get older, you start to get better at your job, you get raises, you move on up in the world. All right. And also, when old people, when their kids get out of the house, they have more money because they don't have to spend it on them. My parents now buy stuff for my their grandson, my nephew, and I'm like, where do you all get all this money to spend? And they're like, well, you and your brothers don't live here anymore, so we have plenty of money. I'm like, you know what? This is ridiculous. Okay. Not only that, but old people, and you'll notice this in your parents too, they always like to pine away for the good old days. They'll tell you about how life was so good when they were young and that the world has changed and it's not for the better. And so ultimately, you like the way that you grew up and the world that you lived in if you had even a halfway decent experience. Right? Old people get set in their ways and they don't like to change. And if you think that's not going to happen to you, think again. Okay? So these are all the factors that influence ideology. You can profile people. All right? You look at the factors about them and you can determine whether or not they're more liberal or more conservative. All right? And if you like basically chart down those things, you can get a sense of where people fall. All right. Now let's talk about Americans real fast and where most Americans fit on the spectrum here. Remember, most Americans will describe themselves as moderate. Okay. They don't want the label. All right. But most Americans are going to describe themselves as moderate. And deep down, there's some truth to that. I don't think most people will wholesale subscribe to what liberalism says or what conservative says. They're going to have a few views that cross over. Right? That's normal. Right? One of the other problems that we're seeing now is tolerance for ideology of others. Okay? We're living in a very polarized world where people look at this, they don't see the political spectrum, they see it as a binary. You're either with us or against us. And that's a dangerous place to be because ultimately, we're all Americans. We do have a lot in common, and you have to remember that if you knew the beliefs of every one of your friends, relatives, the people you care about the most, you'd realize that they are radically different from you. Okay? Now, you take a look at the ideological views by year, though. If they start breaking it down, even though people describe themselves as moderate, there's still a decent number of people who describe themselves as conservative or even liberals. All right, but that number, you can see the trend over time is changing a little bit. The percentage of people who say they're liberal are on the way up, and moderate down a little bit, but still the dominant, or at least they have the plurality of people in this regard. Okay, so look, that's where we're going to stop right now. But one other thing we'll talk about is something when we get back in class. We'll talk about something called the perception gap, where people misperceive the other side in terms of what they think. Like, what do liberals think about conservatives and their beliefs versus what conservatives think about liberals and their beliefs. So we'll talk about that later. But this is to help get you ready for your test. We will do some Teams meetings. Make sure you listen to this, and I hope you guys are having a great day. I'll see you again soon.